All right, here we go. It is Monday, 9 p.m. This is Ungovernable. I am Matt. This is Jocelyn. Do we want to hop right into the wine really quickly? All right.
I don't even know what you got.
Yeah, no, it's really good stuff. So, called Sticks and Stones.
Red blend.
Red blend from Portugal.
Oh, I love red blend.
Yeah, and a favorite of ours, it's a screw top. So,
except it's really hard.
I can help you if it's stuck. We don't do anything. Oh wow, that's like really on there. We don't do anything that's like high end or super bougie or anything like that. Everything's under like $20. So, all right, just a reminder, like, comment, subscribe.
It smells good.
We are streaming right now on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Vim TV, Odyssey, and a couple other places, Twitch. So catch us wherever that you prefer to watch your streaming. If you prefer, this is like a long form format. So if you prefer audio, then you can look up Ungovernable on your favorite podcast platform. So with that, how good is it?
Well, I haven't tasted it yet. It smells really good.
It smells fantastic. Oh yeah, it's nice. Yeah, it's like really light.
That's really good.
Yeah, it's really light.
How much was this one?
I think it was like $14, $15.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah,
I love that.
So all right, cool. We have an awesome program.
I'm gonna learn a lot today.
It's another kind of learning type one.
Yeah.
You are married to someone who professes to be an anarchist.
Do you?
Yeah. But in your kind of like just, very kind of like 30,000 foot view, what do you perceive as anarchy or what an anarchist really kind of like thinks or believes?
Well, we did watch that show on HBO the other day.
Yes. Yeah.
So now I have preconceived notions.
Yeah. Well, even including that, what do you think it is?
I think it goes back to my whole feeling on licensure.
Oh, okay.
That idea that if you want to be a therapist, you have to get licensed.
Yeah.
And then you kind of have to continue education and all of that. And then in the end, I don't understand. And then you have to have licensure in order to get insurance taken.
Yeah.
And people who need to see therapists often need to use their insurance. And the whole thing seems like a scam to me.
Yeah.
And I think, but we've talked a few things about anarchy where I'm like, I don't understand how it would work.
Well, we can talk through those today because we have a special guest. But from your standpoint, that kind of gatekeeping behavior.
Like all of that,
Yeah.
The government, and the agencies and all of this.
You don't like people telling you what you can do with your own body or your own shit, right?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with
Okay, all right. That's a fantastic start. Okay. So all right. So we have Ace Archist with us. Ace, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing really great. Thanks so much for having me on, guys. This is going to be fun.
No. It's all our pleasure. You're going to be teaching class today.
Yeah, I'm going
to learn. All right. So before we get rolling, I always forget to do this and leave it to the end. I want you to be able to put out your stuff so people know where to follow you. So you are Ace_Archist on Twitter, but where else can people subscribe to you or find your material?
Yeah, I also have a Substack, acearchist.substack.com. And then I also do a podcast with my host, Dino from Dino Files, called The End Times Continue. We recently started it. We're like 5 episodes in. And you can find us at tetc.show. We're also on practically every podcatcher, pretty much. So
awesome. tetc.show.
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, so how good did we do? At the very baseline.
I bring it back to my life.
Yeah. At the very baseline, what is anarchy?
Right. So, obviously, right. Whenever you're describing anarchism or explaining it, you always have to go through this, because most people have an understandable preconceived notion that it's obviously chaos, right? And it's obviously been presented that way in many media formats. So it's right. There's no fault for anyone who's like, oh, anarchism, how could that ever work? That sounds crazy. So the burden is very much on the anarchist to explain this. So no one should feel any like, oh, you should never feel like foolish for thinking, oh, well, this couldn't work, because it's not quite intuitive all the time. So, but basically anarchism is like from a philosophical standpoint is basically the idea of each person having the highest claim to their lives and the property that they incorporate, right? So like, if I have the highest claim to myself and you guys have the highest claim to yourselves, then the only way for us to interact in a moral sense would be voluntarily through like consensual interactions, right? Anarchism, one of my favorite philosophers, Roderick Long, has this really great summation of anarchism, which is that anarchism is essentially the idea that it is unjust to treat other people as your property. And it's basically that consistently applied. So the reason the anarchist is opposed to the state is we view the state as an essential intruder into our boundaries, right? So if I have a right to be secure in my boundaries, meaning my body, my property, and the state we view as an institution that inherently invades those boundaries, then we would view the state as an inherent aggressor. Aggression is like kind of this catch-all term that we would use to describe acts that encroach into another person's boundaries, or a type of an act that would subject another person to another person's will. Like if someone is like violently assaulting you, they are trying to subject your body to their will in some sense. So that's just an example, but that's kind of the gist of anarchism. It's basically the idea that, to restate it real quick, like I have the highest claim to myself, you guys have the highest claim to yourselves, each person has the highest claim to themselves and their property, and no one may rightfully intrude upon that or usurp their claim.
Yeah, that's I think that's a fantastic way to look at it. I've also heard people just even kind of like break down the origins of the word anarchy, and it's kind of like, traditional meaning of essentially no masters, right?
No masters, no rulers, and by master or ruler, the anarchists take this specifically to mean a person who encroaches into another's boundaries to subject them to their will. So like if someone like sets up like takes over your property, the anarchist, not all anarchists, I'm not going to get into like the disagreements of different anarchist schools here, but basically from my own perspective, if you incorporate resources into like your ongoing means, this becomes what we would call your property, right? And if someone intrudes upon that property, they're essentially dominating you or dominating your boundaries in some sense by you trying to usurp your claim. So that any person who tried to do that, and I think there are many examples of states doing this, we would consider that person to be a ruler in that regard. Basically, anyone who encroaches into the boundaries of another person to subject them to their will.
Yeah,
I feel like
good.
In the last like 3 years, you've got an opportunity.
Well, and
Quite an opportunity.
That was going to be one of my questions was, so I don't know if you've watched it yet, Ace, but The Anarchists on HBO Max.
I have not yet, no.
Yeah, so what's really interesting is I thought it was going to be a hit piece when I first heard about it, and it doesn't seem to be playing out that way. It really seems to be a somewhat level-headed as possible viewpoint of kind of the anarchist movement. It follows mostly stuff that happens at Anarchapulco, but I was surprised. It's really kind of like a semi kind of like level portrayal of, and it also does a good job of kind of showing the diversity that's also within the anarchist movement. It's not something that's a monolith or anything like that, but it definitely seems like anarchism, at least in terms of public awareness, is on the upswing. What would you attribute to that? Like, why do you think that has come about so recently?
So Emma Goldman has this she was an anarchist, a famous anarchist. She was famously deported by Woodrow Wilson to Russia. She has this quote
yet another shitty thing in his column.
Yes,
so anyway.
So she had this great quote, which is like that the cops are creating more anarchists than I ever will. And I think the state's constant boot on the throats of many people over time increasingly kind of leads to this, right? It at least makes people second guess some of their assumptions, right? Because a lot of people have this assumption that, well, our system isn't perfect, it makes mistakes, but we generally live in an overall just society and just system. And I think the more and more people are awakened to like some of the examples of that not being true, I think that starts people to question the legitimacy of their rulers, really. And I think certainly, like, you know, with the lockdowns and things like that, that's obviously a huge one. And but that's, you know, just on top of a huge history of like state violence that we could imagine. I think that's definitely led to a lot of people kind of being more open to this idea.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I would tell anyone, if you are like really curious about Anarchy, if you're not 100% familiar with it, you could definitely check out the TV series. But there's just a bunch of other things that are kind of like underpinnings that can get you to that point. I mean, just, you know, don't necessarily follow Michael Malice's Twitter account, because that's not that's not like an educational process in Anarchy, but definitely listen to like what he says, or read some of his books, because the dude's on point, because he comes at it from a different standpoint. So it used to be, well, the current practice now is, right, like if you believe we live in a two-party system, which I would argue we live in a one-party system or an oligarchy, the one side is trying to convince the other side of, like, you know, we're the best side and we're the best side. Malice, in true anarchist fashion, isn't trying to convince anyone to come to Anarchy. He's just trying to completely undermine the institutions that everyone have come to be like, you know, oh, this is just, you know, our price to pay to live in a civilized society, or like, you know, this is the justice that we need here. And he does a fantastic job of that, because I mean, they give you all of the ammunition that you need in order to be able to point out just kind of the fallacies that all of that shit is built on, you know? So were you gonna ask a question? Did I step on your toes?
No, I was just gonna say, like, you know, if you just start to open your eyes right now, there's like a lot that's coming out of, like, just if you look at everything and how everything's like, just watching the Russell Brand thing today, I did not know that the government was involved in creating Google to begin with, from the Defense Department. Like, I mean, you start to see like everything is connected.
There goes our YouTube channel.
You start to see it, everything is connected, and like, you have no individual freedom. Like, everything you do is watched in one way or another, you know, like, and, you know, we homeschool, so, you know, there are countries where you can't even homeschool. Like, who knows how it's going to come down here eventually, you know, if the Board of Eds get so, you know, angered at their amount of money coming. But there's so many things that if you start to see how it all connects, you're like, wow, you really, like, the mask comes off, or like the glasses come off. You know?
So one of my introductions, not necessarily to anarchism, but to libertarianism, was through reading Anatomy of the State. I think a lot of people get into the pipeline reading Anatomy, or there's a couple of other books that are kind of these like starter books that people get in through.
Is it an easy read though? Anatomy of the State.
It
is.
Okay.
It's technically a pamphlet. Like, it's not even.
It's like 70 pages. It's a very.
I can tell.
And there's all kinds of footnotes too, so it's not even the whole page. But so I wanted to ask you, Ace, like, how do you view that dynamic between libertarianism, or at least what kind of the normie idea of what libertarianism is nowadays, versus anarchism? Like, is one a subset of the other, or do they kind of have some, you know, separation between the two of them?
Yeah, specifically, do you mean specifically in terms of how normies see it, or
I would say, like, say someone is completely green to both of these ideas, right? How would you explain that dynamic?
I think that to like just a person coming in from the outside who sees libertarianism, I think libertarianism is kind of like an on-ramp to anarchism. I don't think most people who who become libertarians at start necessarily see where the on-ramp leads, but I think they get on it anyway, because libertarianism to most people does provide like really practical like policy proposals that just seem really common sense to most people. And I think that's kind of like what attracts a lot of people. So like, sometimes people might not think that well, you know, the logical conclusion of this whole thing ends at anarchism, But I think in general that it's kind of like the practical policy proposals that they lack from like the left and the right generally that attracts people to it.
It's like the gateway drug.
Yeah, it is.
I would classify it as the gateway truth serum, maybe. You know, it's like libertarianism might be like the red pill or whatever, right? But then anarchy is like when you actually wake up on the Nebuchadnezzar, like that is anarchy, right? Like it's like the gateway you're getting there, you know. How did you, like, without going too far into like your backstory or anything like that, how did you come to anarchy? Was it something that you were immediately drawn to when you were, you know, kind of a young adult, or was there like a
yes. So it was something, there was a process, but it wasn't a long one. I've kind of always had like, I guess, these intuitions to some extent, but I guess they were really awakened actually by Judge Andrew Napolitano on Fox News. He was like kind of my gateway drug. He was my introduction to the whole thing. And it all kind of spiraled from there. So I was just like I thought he had really unique opinions, especially on Fox News. And I really enjoyed his content. And then I kind of like started like searching like other appearances he's been on that led me to like other podcasts. And then I just started like reading and absorbing as much content and information as I could. So this is when I was like, I think like 14 or 15. So I was pretty young. When I just started like absorbing as much as I possibly could on this.
Yeah, that's interesting that Judge Knapp was kind of your a lot of people talk about it like maybe like a Trojan horse or kind of like a camouflaged anarchist like living out in the wild, right? Like when you listen to Judge Knapp, like you're like, oh well, that sounds like a principled libertarian or whatever, and then he starts talking about some stuff. What was the movie that Pete Quinones did? Or
Monopoly on Violence?
Yeah, Monopoly on Violence. And when I saw Judge Knapp in there, I was like, whoa, hold on, wait a minute. You know, like I was like, this seems a little extreme for Judge Knapp, but
there's one video where I think he's at the Mises Institute, and someone says, "You sound like an anarchist," and he goes, "Well, you don't hear me denying anything."
That's awesome. So that's an awesome progression. I love that, because so many people come to it from, you know, different angles, whether it be, you know, left, right, or you know, like me, it took me the better part of 40 years for me to kind of get to this point. Raised as a kid that was basically in a conservative neocon family. Railed against that by going to a liberal university and adopting like really kind of like hippie left kind of stances, and then just magically kind of like the parts that I really liked about kind of the left side and the parts that I liked about the right side just kind of started to kind of like cross over, and there were some sacred cows that had to be slaughtered though. So like like full disclosure, I come from a police family. Like my father and my grandfather were both police officers. And even my father to this day, you know, he's very much he's a supporter of that kind of framework. But from that standpoint, even he's become shook, because like when we talk about these issues, so COVID's a perfect example. When we talk about these issues and he's like, oh, well, you can't vote for those Democrats or anything like that, or if you vote for a libertarian, Republican's not going to get in. And I was like, well, why? And he was like, law and order and all this other stuff. And I was like, well, you realize that law and order is what caused, you know, the police to essentially go to people's houses and, you know, kind of lock them in or drag them out of their businesses. And so, yeah, it's a perfect example of how the system gives you enough ammunition in order to kind of at least lead people down that road, in order to kind of just goose them a little bit in that direction, you know. Let's talk about policing. So I think a lot has been obviously a lot has been talked about policing within the last few years. I think you would agree that the justice system has been fucked for probably the better part of 100 years in this country, at least. A lot of times we have problems with or not problems, but it becomes a difficult conversation, because people will be like, oh, well, what are you, those like Antifa punks, or like, are you part of these like ACAB BLM people? Like they automatically try and put you into, you know, like a mainstream group,
like,
right?
The news always has anarchy across like all with the whole thing that was happening in Seattle.
They used to use the word bedlam. Now they use the word anarchy, and I'm like, you sons of bitches, go back to using bedlam.
Like when you first told me you were talking about anarchy, I was like,
you thought I was going to start dressing all in black and throwing Molotov cocktails.
No, but I was like, whatever.
Yeah. So you get into these conversations a lot online. How do you really approach it when you're talking about just kind of policing in general, especially if it's public policing versus what a lot of anarchists have kind of theorized about, or are openly advocating for more kind of like privatized or local security forces?
Yeah. So I think oftentimes one of the best ways to bring this up, right, is that we all understand about the human capacity for corruption and the fact that we don't like to take responses. Sometimes we just don't like to take responsibility for things we do wrong. And I think a very easy on-road to that is the fact that in most of these situations with the police, is that the police are a localized monopoly. So in any jurisdiction, the police are the localized security force. And so one thing is that when the if a cop does something either illegal or they just harass you in a certain way that may be legal, they're in some ways the judge in their own case, because they have these internal investigations all the time, and they say we investigated ourselves and we found we did nothing wrong, right? So so oftentimes it's like, oh, how shocking. We would not accept this answer if it was a private company, right? If some private company wronged us in some way, and like Walmart or something like broke your arm or something, like some Walmart security guard, and Walmart was like, well, we investigated ourselves and we did nothing wrong. Generally, most people wouldn't accept that as a reasonable answer. So we would expect some third party to kind of investigate here. But because the way the state is set up, they're all getting funding from the same source, right? So one of the things with policing is that like you have the DA often who like statistically often always sides with the police. So there's already kind of like an invested interest in that. So you can kind of see how the incentive structure would sort of be skewed in favor of the police in a legal dispute. You also have the case of because the police are a monopoly fundamentally, they get your tax money whether you like their services or not. Just like any monopoly, they don't have an incentive to provide you a good service, right? Like if there was a one shoe monopoly in your town, for example, and they were a legal monopoly, meaning that no one else was legally allowed to buy or make shoes and sell them on the market, we would expect, obviously, this monopoly would have no incentive whatsoever to make good products, and they wouldn't care about their customers whatsoever, because like where else are they going to go to get shoes, right? And we can apply that to the police too, because the police are, no matter, even if the police do a bad job, oftentimes not only do they not lose money, they get more money. And that's how state monopolies essentially function, is that when the police do a bad job or when the police violate someone's rights, the answer, or when the police fail to stop crime, let's say, they get more of your money. But if there was competition, we would expect security officers to actually provide you a good service, because on the market, they would be incentivized. They would have to provide you a good service, or you could go somewhere else and just swap services. But you can't unsubscribe from the police. If you don't pay your taxes, they will send money. They will send men with guns to go collect you if you don't pay them. Ultimately, that's the ultimate end of what they'll do if you don't pay your taxes. So the answer ultimately is essentially get rid of the monopoly, right? The same standards, the same reasons we oppose private monopolies, the same corrupt incentive structure that exists for private monopolies exists for public monopolies too, and often in worse ways, especially when it's security, right? So an easy way to think about this, if you wouldn't trust the state to monopolize, let's say, food, right? We all understand that would be a very bad idea if the state was the only provider of food, or clothes even, or automobiles. We all understand this would be a very bad thing. We also shouldn't want them to monopolize security or dispute resolution services. That's so I think that's kind of an easy way to kind of go about explaining it.
I feel like too, like I feel like everyone has a police officer in their family somewhere. And whenever he's like, because I say that to him, I'm like, I have cousins that are police officers and they're good guys. Like they're, they wouldn't do that, but you don't know.
This is also the insidious nature of those monopolies, as well as just kind of the growth of the state, is that you end up with millions of people that then defend the state because the state's basically their livelihood, right? They're not defending it based off principle or because they do or don't recognize that it does bad things to other people. They're simply just so Mike Ruffo has a meme where we kind of like drew him out, and it basically just says thank you for protecting your pension, right? And so like every single time one of these stories comes up online, like that's what we respond with, because that's essentially what they're doing. At the end of the day, they're not choosing the person or the public good in a lot of these cases,
They're
especially
taking
where
care
there's
of themselves.
mistreatment. Yeah, they're or if they choose to I think I saw you share the other day a quote that pretty much sums it up, and I forget who said it, but it's essentially just walks you through the thought process of, you know, if law enforcement basically swears an oath to
Robert Hicks.
laws, yeah, like, and those laws are unjust, then therefore they are essentially enforcing unjust laws on people. And that makes them just as bad as the people that put those unjust laws in play, if not worse, because they're the ones that are the enforcement mechanism of it, you know?
Yeah, and I get that. And then I think about how like, and then I think too, like, well, what other jobs are like that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, teachers are kind of, and
Public
how many
education.
people
Yeah.
know teachers?
Yeah.
And now there's police officers in schools with teachers.
Yeah.
And we give our children to them how many hours? Not us.
So before
but how many hours a day?
So before we get on to education,
I totally changed that.
no, that's all right. One last note on the law enforcement thing is New Jersey actually has a test case, and this probably exists other parts of the country too, but down the Jersey Shore, I forget if it was Bayhead or Bayshore. It has Bay in the name.
They privatized, right?
They have a privatized police department.
Does it work?
And they have one of the lowest incidence rates of essentially complaints of violence.
But were they
and
higher
abuse of force.
before they went private?
No, they scuttled the police force and then basically brought in a completely contractual. So
Like, was it always though a low crime?
Well, I mean, it's an affluent area, so it is something where like someone could be like, oh, well, you know, those rich people can afford it or whatever. But I actually think they also operate at a lower cost structure than most of the public police departments that are in other parts of the state.
You do have to wonder how much gas it costs the police officer that drives past our house 8 times.
Yeah, especially today. in this day and age.
I mean, like, why?
All right, so let's kick it over to education. All right, so public monopolies go beyond just use of force. They go into the sphere of essentially education and you know, child rearing or essentially programming.
Yes. I don't even think though, but this is also just going back to policemen. Like my cousins that are I don't think they see themselves as cogs in that machine. Like I think people get into it to do the right thing, just like teachers don't realize what they're doing to kids. They think they're doing the right thing. It's this overarching behind the, I know you hate what I just said. But it's this like behind the curtain shit.
Yeah.
Like they're told, like, I don't know if it's because they grew up in it as well, or like, but I truly believe like these people do not mean to be cogs in that machine.
So let me ask you a question off of that, Ace. So from coming from an anarchist perspective, regardless of what your job is, do you think you get to abdicate moral basically culpability for you executing your job, right? Is that something you can say, well, that's just my job?
Right. Yeah, I don't think that is like an excuse where you can like absolve yourself of moral blame, but I do agree that a lot of people do go into it for what they think are altruistic reasons, right? Or like what might be altruistic reasons. But I do agree that it's not ultimately like an excuse, like just because, you know, I'm just doing my job. But I agree. Yeah.
That's like, define for me cognitive dissonance again.
Cognitive dissonance?
Cognitive dissonance? Did I correctly use that?
Well, I think
like once they get in those positions.
No, I think it might not be universal cognitive dissonance. I think some of them might actually rationalize away that like, oh, well, net, I do more good things than I do bad things, and therefore it's all right, right? Cognitive dissonance is almost like complete detachment. Like,
but I think they do that.
No, I think some of them do.
Teachers definitely do that.
Yeah, no, I think some of them definitely do. And then I think others of them are essentially the system that's in place, or the mechanism by which they kind of weed out the dissenters through, you know, the union process and things like that. You know, there are teachers, there are police officers that will speak out, but they usually end up getting the shit into the stick.
Well,
and it's a fundamental sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, there's just a lot of homeschool moms who were teachers.
Yeah.
They gave it up to homeschool. They're like, I'm not putting my kids there. Like, I'll just stay home. But go ahead.
No, like I completely agree, because I think that ultimately, though, it's a fundamental incentive issue. Just like with the cops, how even if a cop goes in to do what they think is a good thing, the incentive structure is ultimately corrupting, right? So because for a teacher, in the same way that this is not the case in every place, but a lot of places, right? You have truancy laws where you must send your kid to school. You must send them to public school. And for people that I don't think, I feel like, I hope at least people will view that as a great social evil, maybe hundreds of years in the future. But I think that is just like extremely awful.
Like, that's Germany right now.
Right. Well, it's fun. Yeah.
Is it
So,
in the United States somewhere? I don't even know.
well,
Probably.
it's funny because this whole idea of the school system in America came from what's known as the Prussian school system. And basically, the idea was we need to essentially turn education, the process of becoming educated, into almost a factory discipline. We need to turn children into factory workers, and we need to teach them discipline in a very structured format. So, and the goal of this, by the people who created this system, was to create good soldiers, lawmakers, and workers for the society they were in. Good factory workers
we make
and
you a
soldiers.
good factory worker. Yeah.
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 So the first thing like children learn in public school is to essentially view this stranger in front of them, who they were forced to see as an authority figure. That's the very first lesson most children learn in school, is to submit to the teacher's rule, to the point where most children have to like raise their hand to go to the bathroom. Right. Michael Malice has said this in the past, but it's like public schools are you can make a very easy connection that public schools are a type of prison, right? They're a type of prison you get to leave at a certain time every day, but nevertheless, some of the same structures of a prison exist in there. And and I think Michael Mouse also says that, and I think this is absolutely true, public schools are one of the only places most people ever experience physical violence in their life, statistically. And it's like, it's absolutely true statistically. Like the amount of children who are bullied. So this is just heartbreaking, right? If you go onto Google and type in "school makes me" and look at the results that pop up, the suggested search results that popped up, "school makes me" in Google's.
Are you sharing?
Hold on, let me share the tab real quick. All right, so Chrome tab, Google search. Here we go. School makes me feel meme. School makes me depressed and anxious.
It made me
School
depressed
makes me depressed. School makes me feel worthless. School makes me feel sick, tired, feel stupid.
Yeah,
unbelievable.
Those are the most common searches.
That's so
for crazy. School makes me.
That's insane.
I totally believe it though.
During COVID, that analogy with the prison analogy was also, again, this is like, the freaking clown world that we live in. That analogy became a lot easier because in many school districts, the teachers didn't go back to school, but the kids did. And so the kids were in classrooms with a virtual teacher in front of them. But guess what adult was in the room?
The police officers?
Security officers and police officers. So they literally had students lined up in a classroom with a patrol officer or security officer that was armed in the room. And they had like a virtual teacher or whatever. How insane. Awful and insane, but also amazing is that imagery for someone who thought that their kid was going to this fantastic place all day long.
And then some of them were in like glass cases too for COVID. And it was just like,
that was insane. And I'll tell you, I used to work in a juvenile justice system, and there you see it too. You want to talk jail system?
Oh, yeah.
And honestly, I was glad people had guns when I was in there. I had more than my share of like being a little 20-year-old girl and trying to get and do things, but I mean, the way the education in the jails works, it's like they're actually the jail. I found this out when I was there. The jail the correctional, I don't know what you call it, juvenile justice system correctional center.
Nope.
They actually make more money when kids don't get GEDs than if they do get them. They get $12,000 less per student if they don't get a GED while they're in there. So like
they're actually financially incentivized to get them through.
To get them without a GED.
No, wait, hold on. You got to roll that back. So they get $12,000 more if the kid doesn't get a GED. Okay, so they're actually financially incentivized for them to fail.
And then the only people for the kids in the juvenile justice system were the Muslim.
That was
Muslim religious group.
Yeah,
they were awesome.
This was an interesting story, Ace. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially it was not the system that produced the people that came in that looked after these kids to try and better their lives, but it was essentially someone from the outside Muslim community that came in voluntarily to teach these kids. And
he got them really strict too. They wouldn't eat Twizzlers. I know that much.
Yeah.
To get a teenager not to. No, and they would drug up these kids because once you were in there, they told you what to do, what to take, and they'd all have the shuffle on. It's not. It's and the racial divide was for real.
Well, in public schools, you don't gotta get them with a jab. You just give them ADHD medication or some other shit.
I can't even. And the way so this is like seeing the Matrix, right? Like seeing how it all connects. Like pharma, all of the companies, the security, the teaching. Like, where the fuck do you have any choices left?
Yeah.
Right. Don't he got me on taxes after my parents died. We have learned, I have learned about taxes, something I never knew. Or 10,000. Like, I cannot even believe how much money the state takes. And then when you finally file your death taxes for people that died, you have to wait 8 months. And that entire 8 months, they can randomly call you up to audit you.
Yes.
This shit is crazy. And they could send police here if we didn't pay that shit.
I feel like everyone watching right now.
I can't even.
I feel like everyone watching right now, real time, is seeing you descend into. You're like anarchist. Let's go. None of that
shit. Oh, that's funny.
In your ideal scenario, Ace, or not your ideal scenario, because you're not necessarily wanting to project this a lifestyle onto other people. You're as an anarchist, you just want to live a free life yourself. Ideally for you, it's essentially what private school and homeschooling are kind of the roots.
Private school, homeschool, like school co-ops, things like that. Anything that's voluntary is A-OK by the anarchist standards.
Yeah.
So here's a question.
Yeah.
This is like a debate in the New Jersey homeschool world. You want to fight, right? So like the OG homeschoolers, we're like, you don't rock the boat. You don't ask for the money that goes to the school district. You don't ask for any of those taxes back. You they let us be, right? And then you had COVID happen, and all these moms came in and they're like, we should get tax credits, right? And so they want to fight it. But the old school ones, homeschoolers, like, don't fight it because you're going to mess with the balance of everything. Yeah. So do you just move to Acapulco?
Yeah.
Is that what it is? I don't even know.
I think one of the kind of in my opinion, I think personally, if you can get your tax money back, you should take it. But in this scenario, I think there's something insidious with tax credits that they do with homeschooling, which is that what they'll try to do is what they often try to do when the state gives you a tax credit. And what they'll do is they say, okay, we'll give you this tax credit, but you must abide by these terms and conditions now.
Yes, that's why we're all like, don't rock the boat.
Yeah.
But what do you do? Yeah. What do you do? Do you move? I don't even know what you do.
Yeah, it's a tough scenario.
Hold on. I'll give you the answer after. But so would you also extend that, Ace, to this whole voucher program that a lot of the people on the right are trying to push?
So I think just on a cost benefit thing, I do like vouchers just for the fact that it does give people more choice. But on top of that, I think it's also a deal with the devil type situation where it's you have more choice, but these choices then come with often come with state terms and conditions, which I still think is better than just being forced into public schools, mind you. I do think that is a better thing, just having the choice there, but it's still one of those situations where it's like, I think homeschooling is just a superior model where the state is just not involved at all. I think that's the best of the best.
It's hard because the minute you get a tax credit, they're like, well, this is the curriculum you have to do.
Yes, exactly.
And all of us homeschoolers like, shut up.
Well, so this is the discussion we've had multiple times about universalized healthcare. Is all of these people that are would-be masters, or they currently masters, they only think in terms of when they're in power, right? And so I've had this argument with lots of people in the past. I've said, like, I'm not exactly against vouchers, but like, just take universalized healthcare. If you had universalized healthcare under Democrats and then all of a sudden Republicans took over in the legislature, they're going to defund things that you thought were going to be covered, right? And then they're going to laugh in your face when they do it, right? And I'll laugh in your face when you do it, because how could you be so stupid and not see that coming, right? The same thing happens with vouchers or stipend programs. Is it's not a stone's throw away until, all right, if they lost that fight, the next fight they're going to have is, all right, if you receive public money, you have to teach this, you have to teach this, you have to do that, right? Like, and that's the one thing. So I was going to tell you what my answer was to be. My answer was going to be, keep your mouth shut and practice tax evasion. That's the best way.
Now the cops are coming every other day. Like, oh,
I said evasion. I did not say the other word.
I feel like there's no way. I mean, it's like, all of us have said, you just like, because in New Jersey, you don't have to like sign your kids up to it. It's like one of the only states you don't have to tell them you're going to homeschool. So everyone's like, okay, if they change things, and with the whole vaccinate, they think eventually they'll try to vaccinate homeschoolers, put them on a registry kind of thing. And so you stay as long as you can till someone comes knocking on your door, and then you just flee, like, because hopefully it takes forever for things to happen. And we live in the United States of America. I mean, that's fucked up.
Do you fall on kind of the agorist part of the side here, Ace? I mean, like, is it of your opinion that all we really have to do is kind of like get enough people to be essentially living a life that's contra to all this other crap, and that essentially the system will fall down around itself?
Yes, I would generally side with agorists there, and I would consider that a very moral like strategy. I think I'm not sure the system will collapse necessarily from. So some agorists make it seem like the system will collapse just from a certain amount of people like collecting, not paying their taxes, but then the state can just print money, right? So I think it's not as much like we're going to withhold their funds. I think the benefits of agorism that I really like are it's like, okay, we're going to carve out a little part of our world here and live anarchy. That's what really attracts me.
Can you define agorism? I know you say this all the time. What is that?
Yeah. Agorism is essentially what's known as counter-economic action. So counter-economic action would be action that's not necessarily like above board, let's say, in legal terms, but it's actions that is both voluntary in the sense that it doesn't create a victim, right? It's consensual between all parties, but it's also not necessarily always legal. So like not documenting your taxes for like, let's say a garage sale or something like that, not filing your garage sale income on your tax form. That is in some sense a counter-economic
garage sales on your income. So I've never had a garage sale. But are you
just purely theoretically.
There are no garage sales happening. No, technically you're supposed to report all of that shit.
What about kids having a lemonade stand?
One of the gateways into talking to people about agorism is things like that. So a lemonade stand, any waiter or waitress that takes their tips in cash and don't necessarily bump up their take-home pay. Any of those kind of like voluntary transactions. I mean, anyone who's ever traded goods and services for gold, silver, Bitcoin, things like that, all of those are essentially agorist activities.
I get it.
And agorism also has this element of self-sustainability, which I think is whether you fall on the agorist or kind of like the market anarchist side of the conversation, or if you fall onto like maybe the more libertarian side. And like I asked you the libertarian anarchist question before. I'm like, from my standpoint, I think anarchy is essentially the purest form of libertarianism, right? It's and what's funny is a lot of libertarians still have a mental block because there's like that border, that boundary that they're afraid to get to. But
I think most libertarians like are introduced to the term through the political party, through the existence of the political party, and then that it's kind of hard for them to disconnect that, because it's like, well, how can the logical inclusion of this political party be anarchism, right? You know, that I think that's sort of like why a lot of people kind of have a disconnect there.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, what I like about the agorist mentality or perspective, or if you want to call it, you know, an ideology or philosophy, is that it really promotes at least either self-sustainability or community-based sustainability, completely voluntary.
But you would have to be, so this is my thing. You would have to have such a huge community to defend yourselves, wouldn't you? Like, wouldn't you have to have such a huge community?
So and my FBI agent is buzzing me.
Oh, wait, like the other thing is like, so
ask Ace about community defense or community security.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think like just in terms of like community defense, so it's absolutely true that, right, like there's this idea of like, you know, well, if the entire federal government, including like the army and the National Guard, come knocking, it's true that your local community isn't going to have a good time. A good time will not be had by all. But with that being said, I think generally, it's not, if it got to a point where like we can theorize how like, well, yeah, one little community versus the entire national army, it's probably not going to turn out well. But you have to think about like in terms of like if agorism spreads and you have like all these different like disparate communities out there, it's likely not going to be cost effective for the state in general to go out and police all these different things, right? We talk about things like, for example, there's many things that are illegal in name but are just never enforced. Piracy is one example. I of course wouldn't know anything about that, but you know, I've heard stories that it's just never enforced. So you know, just things like that. So because it's just not cost effective for the state to actually go out, right? Like you take down one pirate site or something like that, and then the 2-3 more pop up in the next minute. So
that's like Netflix sharing your password,
right? Exactly. Yeah. So in terms of like actual defense, though, right? So this is often a criticism against anarchism, and I think it's on itself, it's not a bad criticism in itself. I think the problem though is that there's just other instances where it applies to states as well, right? So like it's true that like if you imagine your local community versus the entire state of into the entire country of China or something, right? It's obviously China's they're going to win, right? If you like versus your little local community, but that can also apply to states too, right? So if you like think, well, that's why we need a state, you could also say, well, your state could also be invaded by a bigger state too, and then you're kind of facing the same problem. So it's a good criticism, but it's not unique to anarchism inherently. And ultimately, there's also a good point where you actually would rather have a decentralized defense as opposed to a centralized defense. And one example is this. Let's imagine two Americas, right? One America has no central government whatsoever. You have anarchist territories all over the place, and they're not centrally controlled by any person or institution. And then the other America is the current day America, where we have a federal government and the nukes are controlled by the president in Washington, D.C. Okay.
Scary thought.
Yeah. Now, if China invades both of these Americas, for China to actually gain, to dominate America, they have to stage a land invasion and actually go through all the territories of America in the anarchist America, right? Versus if China theoretically invaded today, and I don't think they would do this. I don't think it's likely. So I'm not saying this is likely to happen. But if they did, theoretically, they could just take over Washington, D.C.
Right, where all the people are.
or then that have that central power structure, and then get all the other territories in the United States to kind of surrender because they have the central power structure under their control. So
And
it's
what would
much better
happen?
than right.
What would happen is Governor Phil Murphy would end up fucking still alive.
Yeah.
He would end up. It would be awful.
No, I love that analogy because
that makes sense to me.
I love that analogy because most of the what's the line that Malice uses? He basically says that most of the critiques or the pushback against anarchy is just a description of the current status quo, right?
Yes.
Yes. That's that, and from that standpoint, I was talking to someone the other day about states' rights and decentralization, and they were essentially saying like, wouldn't we be weaker? Wouldn't we get invaded and that kind of thing? And they're like, what about China? China's already kind of like infiltrating our government. We've already known that freaking Swalwell had an affair with a spy and all this other stuff. And I was like, well, what's easier to take over? A country that has one or a few power seats that you have to corrupt, or you would have to corrupt thousands and thousands of people, and I don't think people think that way. I think people think in terms of this kind of like archaic view of, or this kind of like fantasy past view of what the United States used to be like. And I always take them back to the I forget who it was, the chairman or the consulate that they asked from Japan, and they asked like, well, why did you never plan a land invasion of the United States? And dude says, because there was a freaking sniper behind every single blade of grass. Like I would have to be stupid to do something like that, right? You know.
I have two questions.
Good.
How big is the anarchist community in the United States? And
what are you, a Fed?
What's the difference between I want to know. Do you have people who will come at and help and watch your back? But also, what's the difference between an anarchist community and a hippie commune?
Oh, this is a good question.
Because this is what I say to him. I'm like, I'm all up for a hippie commune.
Okay,
we have bonfires and dancing.
So
make jewelry.
Our numbers are estimated but not accurate. So let's not even talk about that. But let's discuss.
I do think it's a hard question, like estimating the numbers. You know what I mean?
Are there bigger communities that are in the, or do people kind of lay low?
I think it's very disparate. I think it's very people lay low, and I don't know of I know of a couple anarchist places in the world, but I don't know of any anarchist communities necessarily in America specifically.
Yeah. So let's talk the dynamic. So this is something that comes up a lot, especially within anarchy circles, where everyone's like, well, ANCOMs or ANSOCIAs are not anarchists, right? Because they believe in some level of centralization of power or forced association or theft, right? But in a lot of cases, I don't know if you've spoken with Magnus Panvidia in the past, but he coins himself as basically an anarcho-mutualist. So he believes in kind of this hippie commune life, but
so that's
voluntarily, right?
Yeah.
But so what's your take on that dynamic? Is that something, first of all, is that even an important conversation to have, or is it just cool if a bunch of people are like, whatever, you're ANSOCIANCOM, I don't care, just as long as you're not a freaking neocon or a liberal corporatist, I don't care.
I'm willing to let people define themselves in terms of terms, you know what I mean? But from my standpoint, I do think that is absolutely anarchism, right? Because it's so a good way to view anarchism is a relationship. So I think when a lot of people talk about anarchism, they hyper focus on what an anarchist society would look like, because understandably so, because it's kind of this really esoteric thing that we're promoting. Right. But anarchism at its base is ultimately just a relationship between people. So whenever you are interacting with another person in a voluntary manner, and neither of you are trying to impinge on another person's boundaries, through force, fraud, or anything like that, you're treating another person as an end in themselves. You're treating them as a sovereign in terms of their boundaries, and they're treating you as a sovereign in terms of your boundaries. So whenever you guys are interacting voluntarily, that's an anarchist relationship there, because no one is trying to rule over the other. Yeah.
I love that. And I feel like that means that hippie communes are a subset of anarchism.
Well, yeah, no.
As long as it's not a cult.
Some of them are. What defines it is whether or not there is, essentially a purely voluntary association amongst all the
Well,
people in there.
when
But you've heard me say in the past that collectivism is a disease, right? Like that's what keeps people from truly understanding the nature of anarchy. It's
okay, just quickly,
like they identify
define collectivism.
So collectivism is any time when an individual identifies more with the collective than they do with themselves as an
Okay.
individual, right?
Alright.
So, for instance, I think Ace would be on board with this. Part of the propagandizing or the brainwashing that happens in schools is when you have to salute the flag, right? Like,
Or like COVID and anti-vaxxers.
nationalism is collectivism, right?
Right.
Yes, yeah, the mass formation of basically this pro-COVID regime that we have is a
Yeah.
form of collectivism, right?
Okay.
It's us versus them kind of
So when
situation.
there's like a larger thing that people hail to before they're into, like, it's kind of what we talk about. We're
So-
always like, can
so
we
for
just get
instance-
back to nature?
For
and
instance, if you had a hippie commune where everyone was cool, you shared everything, it was all,
Yeah.
and then
but
someone's
we're
like,
not like talking about a guru.
these are my strawberries, I freaking grew these strawberries, and everyone's like, hey, you got to share those strawberries, and they're like, fuck it, I'm out. And they take their strawberries and they're like, oh no, you can't leave. That's
Those
no
strawberries are
longer
too good.
that's
Okay,
no
I
longer
get it,
anarchy.
I get it.
If that makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
And I feel like when you were talking about the whole voluntary thing, I just pictured myself going into the local coffee shop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I voluntarily go
Yeah,
there
when
and
it-
voluntarily get my coffee, and I'm happy to
That's-
pay because I know the owner.
Yeah, that's the cool thing about anarchism that I think I think anarchists should promote more, which is the fact that anytime you're in an interaction where it's completely voluntary, you're acting as an anarchist. So most people act as anarchists 99% of their lives, right?
That's like
Most
an
people.
amazing point. Like if
Yeah.
people could get that and just
Yeah.
like sit back with the fact that like there's no need to do it. There's no push, no force, right? And how many times do you do that in a day? Like
Yeah.
that you're already practicing. That's like a huge piece of it to me.
Yeah.
Saying that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I
Ace,
think.
I cut you off.
Oh no, sorry. If you no, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna pull up Dan Francisco's in the chat and he said, you guys still talking about Antifa? I don't know if you've interacted with Dan online. He's an awesome dude. He's Blue Star Union's like a nonprofit here in New Jersey that's like awesome for natural rights 2A and everything like that. And he's done fantastic work. He's in fact working on a hopefully I'm not blasting him in a way that I'm not supposed to be talking about this, but he's a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey, fighting against the freaking cruel laws that the state the state has against the citizens in this state about being able to defend themselves. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, but
can I have another question?
You don't just ask for permission. This is a voluntary society. Go ahead.
So if we were to move toward a more anarchist society, what has to happen?
Well, I don't
governmentally and like
I'm going to cut off. I'm going to cut Ace off for a second. I'm going to say, I don't think you should think that way. I think you should think.
You just do you.
I don't think you should think in terms of societal. Like
just
if it gets to that point, great.
And your family.
Right. Okay. So, what would you say to that question, Ace?
I would completely jump off of what you just said there because I think that's a key point, right? I think a lot of people think about like what has to happen socially, but
you can't do it for other people because it's not voluntary, right?
Well, yeah, you can't do it for other people. In some sense, they have to kind of come to it on their own. But it's also to a point where H.L. Mencken has this great quote where he's like, I love liberty, but I don't love it enough to force it on other people, which is kind of paradoxical, but it's kind of has truth to it, where it's this case where it's like, first you kind of have to start with yourself, right? So anarchism, I think, is best described as an ethos. It's kind of like this everyday thing you sort of have to like live, because like the truth is, right, we can't control the outcome ultimately of like whether the state's going I don't mean to say that we're powerless, but it's like there's a lot of things that are just out of our control of our everyday lives. But what is in your control is how you treat other people. Right. Every day you can choose to treat other people as an anarchist. You can choose to treat people as beings with rights that should be respected, with like human dignity and things like that. And you can always choose to do that. That is always within your power. So that is, I think, what people should promote to other people. And it's like, yeah, look, anytime you are treating another person with as a sovereign, as an end in themselves in some sense, as something that like this person has inherent moral dignity and rights. You're treating them as an anarchist, and you should. And when you frame it in that sense, I think more people tend to get it because it's like, oh yeah, I do that all the time. So, and the only discrepancy, is the state is the only institution in society that does not do that. The state treats you as a means to their end. They treat you as a tool, as a cog in their machine.
How did Russell Brand say it today? A hemorrhoid on the asshole of something
of society.
On the hemorrhoid on the asshole. That's how we're treated.
So
that was awesome.
So let's go down that road a little bit. So let's kind of like go down the right road. This gets talked about a lot and can cause people to go around in circles. And I know you discuss this a lot online. The idea of, kind of the foundations of anarchy being essentially self-sovereign. And I guess you would maybe kind of agree with the idea of, say, like natural law, right? Not necessarily natural law in the context of, one creator saying what is, just what's observable, right?
Just what is like that there are natural norms, there are natural moral laws that we should abide by, or that is morally good. Like it is objectively wrong to like murder. It is objectively wrong to rape, to steal, things like that.
Those are like the cornerstones of most religions and spirituality as well. Like those I mean, whether they practice them or not, that's like but like even the oldest, most ancient ones have the do no harm, piece.
I think it's very intuitive for a lot of people too, and just in general, that's just an intuitive thing that most people recognize.
You know what, I feel like, and I've talked to Matt about this a lot, I've said so many people are on mood altering drugs and so many people are on fucking pharmaceuticals that have all kinds of fucking mood altering side effects that who's a real person anymore? Like, and honestly, all people piss that shit into our water and we're using that water and that doesn't get filtered out. Like, I don't even know where we're going with this whole world right now, but like, I feel like people there's problems.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it, but there's so many people that are I just read a post today that said, have you ever thought about women who meet men and they're on birth control, which is giving them hormones, and then they break up as soon as they get off birth control because they don't like them anymore. And you think about how many women are on fucking birth control.
Yeah.
Like, we're so altered by pharmaceutical drugs that I don't even know if we have that natural instinct to give a shit about each other. Like, I don't even think it's there. I've watched, and on top of it, add social media, and you add these elements of like being behind a screen and being a dick to everyone. I don't know. I feel like
well, hold on.
There's so much there to unpack. Are we human?
You have to peel the onion.
I don't trust people anymore.
Yeah, you have to peel the onion back. But so from that standpoint, like discussing in good faith, Ace, like what do you think the biggest hangups are for people really trying to get that baseline understanding of that kind of like, just the natural state of things, or the natural morality that exists, regardless of how they get to it, whether they think there's some supreme being or whether or not they think it's just exists because they do. What do you think the biggest hangups are?
So in terms of just like morality in general, like there's an objective moral, like how people come to it, or how like or just the biggest hangups to recognize it, I guess. Is that
like what are the biggest mental blocks? Because I think a lot of people
for that natural
I think it would resonate with them. I mean, some of the stuff that you were talking about where they may just be kind of like shells of themselves because they've been beaten up by the system, or they've been essentially put on mood altering stuff. Or the other thing being, religion is also one of these things that really kind of it can help the conversation or it can really hurt the conversation, because from my perspective, there's also been a lot of co-opting of religions to meet political ends. I mean, you see it happening in the Vatican right now, right? Like, I mean, it is like, it just is, right? But so like, what are the biggest things that you come up against in terms of having that conversation? Is it simply just the definition of words? Like, I'd imagine that gets in the way a lot.
Yeah, semantics are a big problem. Language is a harsh mistress.
Yeah.
It So I think in terms of like morality, I think in terms of like when you talk to people, for me, it's very easy to get people on board with the idea that you should not rape, murder, or steal. Most people like tend to internalize that from the people I've spoken to. And I would actually argue that it's mostly cognitive dissonance. It's the separation they make between, well, it's wrong for me or you to murder or steal, but these people called the government, if they have a badge or they have a certificate that they wrote themselves, they get to do it. Right.
Yeah.
It's okay for them to do it. And I think it's this cognitive dissonance where it's like they create this separation between if I went up to you with a gun and said, give me your money, I want to give it away in your name, you would call the cops. But who do you call when it's the cops doing that?
Yeah.
They say, you need to pay your taxes.
There's so many people that like what I would think is natural, and this is just going, and I'm totally totally stop me if I'm like drunk or something.
No,
But I was just having this conversation about the Roe v. Wade thing with Matt, and I'm like, I am appalled at how many women are calling, and whatever you believe is fine, but like for the murder of babies. Not that it's a problem. Like, I'm totally for it in certain ways, in certain avenues, but like all these women out there screaming to kill babies and happy about it. And like, to me, that's so anti what a woman is. And we are in this weird fucking sphere of a world where I feel like I don't trust the human beings around me. like I don't know, there's such anger and people get crazy over certain things and they'll like totally drop friendships that you have no idea why, or it's right. Do you hear what I'm saying?
No, so
can you translate me?
Yeah, no. So take a hot button issue like that, Ace. Like as someone who believes in self-sovereignty, as someone who believes in kind of the natural state of things, where do you kind of like fall on that? Like, I mean, I can tell you that my position is that great, the Supreme Court said that it goes to the states, and then I think the next step is to tell the states to go fuck off, and then the local community should then be the next level, right? But I mean, like, where do you kind of like sit on that level? Because it is an extremely hot
weird level. It's a weird issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is also like a divisive issue just for libertarians in general, and it's understandable why, right? Because like on one level, like for some libertarians, it'll be like the argument, because if you start from an argument of self-sovereignty, they'll say that, well, it's my body, it should be my choice, right? That's a very common thing even for libertarians. And then for other libertarians, they'll be like, well, the baby has a right to. So it really fundamentally comes down to like whether you believe the child has rights. I tend to argue that I do believe they have rights. So my argument is a little bit nuanced here. So my argument is that you do technically have a right, and this is going to sound like really almost autistic, like going down to breaking it like property analogies here.
Company.
So my thought process here is that while I do believe you have a right to evict, I don't necessarily believe you have a right to kill in your eviction, right? So for example, if like this is going to sound like we're going to go to some really wacky places here. Let's imagine like a mad scientist, for example, stitched us together with our intestines. Okay. Now, while I think both parties here would have a right to evict each other from the other person's body, I don't necessarily believe that you would have a right to kill the person in the eviction. So there's a certain level of proportionality that kind of has to like be at play here, right? Yep. So ultimately, so maybe this is another point with but I think there's another point where people are like, well, doesn't that mean cops will be like really invasive now? You're sending police in to like investigate like potential abortions and things like that. Right. So my position is I am not saying that I necessarily want, I do not want that to happen, right? Because I, personally speaking, I believe in restorative justice. I believe in restitution when possible. So I'm not in favor of like, I'm not necessarily in favor of like state punishments. So that's where I technically make both sides mad here, because on one hand, I do think that I do think a strict libertarian answer would say that you have a right to evict, but you don't have a right to kill in your eviction. But on the other hand, I don't want cops going around necessarily and arresting people or throwing them in prison. I don't want people thrown in prison for this.
So like I come from, and I, you know, as a woman, I took a morning after pill once in my life, and I was definitely needed, and whatever, you know, I never had an abortion, but I did have a stillbirth the same week as my best friend had an abortion. But I mean, and I get the mother's body thing, but to me, it's like what struck me the most was women who birthed this world into existence, like just calling for murder. It wasn't whether you sit on one side or the other. I was like absolutely taken aback by that piece of it. And so that's why I don't trust people anymore. I don't know where they're going. I don't know how programmed they are.
Well, the way I also kind of like resolve this issue is that pretty much you need to make those decisions as close to the stakeholders as possible. Okay. I am not a stakeholder in someone's life who lives in California. I just am not. Right. Like,
how can you say what someone in California should
do? Like they might do something that is a butterfly effect that ends up affecting me in New Jersey. But quite frankly, like, what do I give a shit what a woman does with her body in California? Right. So it should be taken care of in California.
Why would
you
care what a woman does in your town and what a woman doesn't? What's the difference?
But so then within California, there's a huge diversity of thought. There's a huge diversity of community within California. So who has the right in Sacramento to determine what someone in San Diego does with their body, right? So, all right, let's knock it down to the next level.
And then you can go easily to the next place, should you need to go.
So I think the local community-based decision-making is important here. I don't think it should be criminalized. I know that this pisses off like people that are purists on the pro-life side, but I don't think it should be criminalized, because the moment you criminalize it, you end up with shit that's just as bad.
Oh, you have black market shit
as the alternative.
Not that black market's bad.
as the alternative. Well, no, I mean, and that's the other thing.
You end up with bad shit. That's what Dirty Dancing was about, right?
No,
everyone remembers the romance, but in the end.
But so, like, to that point, right? Like, it makes more sense to be dealt with on a community level as well, because this is such a nuanced thing.
So nuanced
that the correct answer is probably that there is no good answer.
No good answer.
Right?
I agree.
And it should be up to individuals, families, and at most the local community around them in order to figure out, how you move forward. Right. But like, and just think about it this way. Who does it like in the centralized authority structure that we have right now? It affects state funding, because if the child now needs to either if the child is basically their pregnancy is terminated and the state pays for that or subsidizes it, it affects the taxpayers. If the child is had and ends up in the welfare system, it affects the taxpayers.
Right, so here's
it shouldn't have to get to that point. It should be a local community.
If I lived in a community, and I have always, by the way, I've always wanted, I think it's so weird to say this word, but I think orphanages have been absolutely like just demonized, and I think they could be amazing. I did work with one orphanage as an expressive art therapist, and like every week they had new artists in. The boys were amazing. Like, I feel like orphanages have been absolutely dehumanized.
Who crowded the orphanages out?
Well, no, I'm telling you right now.
Who crowded the orphanages out?
I don't fucking know, but
the government. That's who did. Okay, sorry.
If I had a spot in an anarchist community, I would totally run the orphanage.
Yeah.
I would totally run the orphanage, and I would rock that shit. I would homeschool everyone. We would have a lot of fun.
Yeah.
That brings up actually a great point, because when a lot of times when you talk about anarchism, one of the first things people will come at you with is, well, who would run this, or this, right? Or who would help the poor? And my question is, well, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I would totally run the orphanage.
Yeah, like my answer to that is, well, why won't you have, like, can you help these people? Is there a reason that you're not?
People want to help when they
They
have
do.
energy.
They do.
I feel like we have so much sickness, but like when they
Yeah.
have the energy, and here's the other thing: the stress of our lives because of taxes, because of everything that we have to do. You have to keep up so much to play with, like, I mean, you have to keep up so much to keep your life in like a stable place. Like the stress levels are huge. And how can you can't help anybody. You can't even help your own kids. You're so happy to get them off to their fucking soccer game or something, or get them off to school, right? Not us.
That,
Well,
that's not
but the stress level.
but that's not unintended. That's a feature of the system that's been put in place.
Well, I'm sure, because they just have to continually pump it up and push it up. I mean,
Well,
like,
it keeps you from rioting in the streets, is what happens.
you're too exhausted.
Yeah.
You're like, I need a vacation and I can't afford it, so I better work 40 more hours. But like, like that, I think people are like, who would do that? But if they had the time and the energy, they would, like, people would find meaning
Yeah.
in. We talked about this other day. No one has meaning in life anymore.
Well, so I think between your point and Ace's is absolutely, like, there's a lot of crossover there. I think a lot of people have come to either expect or come to just assume that they can vote for someone that will
Yes.
take care of the
Do it
thing
for them.
that they think is
Yes.
needed,
Yeah.
right?
But the government sucks at that shit.
So, I mean, the governmental structure that's in place
Well,
essentially destroys that. Like, would you agree with that, Ace?
absolutely, 100%. Because for one, the government has an incentive. This is unlike, and goes back to, like, monopoly versus a competitive market. The government has an incentive to do a bad job, because then they get more money. Because they'll say, "Oh, we'll fix it next time," right? And then they do a bad job, and they'll say, "Well, we need more money to fix it again." So they have this constant, like, infinite regression of incentive structures that'll just say, "Oh yeah, we just need more and more money." But and to the point where it's like, as far as like local communities go, it absolutely, most people, and this is like, comes from a like what I would call a Hobbesian mentality. Thomas Hobbes famously said that, well, people in a state of nature, their lives are just short, brutish. It's just an awful time, and people are essentially just always trying to kill each other, right? And that's sort of like the natural state of humanity. But that's not true. Like, there are constant instances where people just go out of their way to help another person, even when they receive no benefit to it. And often in like really like horrific situations, like natural disasters, where they'll often, like, there's a good chance
Like
they could die
9/11.
from this. Yeah. So people are not naturally evil. They do want to help. They do want to do good. There's of course people who do want to do bad, but it's not, you can't just generalize and just say that humans
Sometimes,
are
though, I
just
think
bad.
for people to come together, it has to be like a massive fucking problem.
Oh yeah, that's
like
true.
9/11 totally brought New Jersey and New York together. So like
Mhm.
I get that. Like, I mean,
For like,
I had lived in Massachusetts, which is where all the airplanes came out of, and my uncle died in the second tower, and my whole friends and family worked in the city. And I
Yeah.
remember, like, I was in Massachusetts during that, and my family was calling me, like, it's amazing here. I'm like, I don't know what's going on
Yeah,
here.
no,
but
no.
in Massachusetts.
Yeah, but in New York and New Jersey, that lasted for about 15 minutes.
I heard it lasted for a year. It
Nah,
didn't last for a year.
And then after
I don't
that,
know.
like, people would pass by you in the subway and they'd be like, "Fuck you, buddy!" Like, it was the same
But it
exact thing.
takes like
Yeah.
a major event, and it's like, you fucking lost out here. I don't know. I do there. I mean, I don't want to sound so awful. I do believe in human nature, and the people I meet that are like on the road to spirituality of whatever kind, like just some kind of meaning in life. It doesn't even matter if it's spirituality. They rock my boat.
Yeah.
And I feel like, let's start a hippie commune.
I mean, there's I think what you said before was completely correct, though, whereas like there's this offsetting of responsibility where, like, well, you say, well, I don't need to I don't need to help this person who's homeless right now. I pay my taxes, right? Because it's like, well, the government will solve it. The government will create some policy. They'll solve this issue for me. I don't need to do anything. So it really lessens the responsibility someone feels in their direct community. It's like, well, this institution that's taking my money, they're supposed to handle it. That's their job. Whereas before, there used to be these things called mutual aid societies or associations or fraternities, where people who were poor or just downtrodden in society, they would come together and they would provide services that none of them could afford individually in kind of a mutual pool. And they would socialize their services together. So like if one person couldn't afford like either housing or medicine or medical procedures or something, or just even like just investigation, or like maybe the government didn't provide them good police services, they would provide communal or mutual defense funds.
This goes to a question I thought of before, but I forgot to ask. But
Yeah.
it makes sense now that you've said that, which is, how do you feel about insurance? Because like fucking can't stand insurance because I'm a holistic person and it never fucking covers anything I give a shit about.
Hold on.
It's funny because it's funny because this is actually leading to a point where I was going to end with here for this particular point, where it's funny because this was actually insurance before it was bastardized. Which is that you had people who would pull their resources together and provide. So a classic example of this, oftentimes what these mutual aid associations would do is they would provide medical care for their, or they would contract medical care out for their members, right? And what would happen is you would have these doctors who would be directly contracted out to these mutual aid associations. And what would happen is these doctors would then compete for the contracts, right? So what this would do is this would lower the price of healthcare because you had these doctors competing to be the one who would contract for this mutual aid society, right? And a bunch of the doctors, these doctors like these, what would happen is that they would say, we don't like this because it's driving the cost of medical care down too low. We are not being paid enough for our service. So you know what they did? A lot of them did, is that they went to the government, and the government essentially created the American Medical Association, the AMA.
Oh my God.
And what happened is the AMA was granted essentially a legal privilege to determine who could become a doctor.
And they're taking licenses of doctors who call this COVID bullshit.
Yeah.
And they're taking they would threaten to strip licenses from the doctors who provided medical care for these poor mutual aid associations. They would threaten to strip them of their licenses to be doctors if this happened. And that is
this goes back to my first question of licensure.
The government essentially destroyed mutual aid associations, and they essentially, the reason healthcare costs in this right now are just so exorbitant are because the government destroyed competition. The government and the AMA working together destroyed medical competition and practices.
Well, I say to Matt all the time, I say, like, I'm sorry, I totally cut you off. Did you want to say something?
No, go ahead. I'll make my point after.
Well, I say to him all the time, like, insurance and medical places are like in it together. Like, they never think about like doing anything for the people. There's just, you have to run through every fucking test when it has nothing to do. Like, my mom went in to the I'm sorry, you totally throw your head down. My mom went in for COVID in the hospital, and she ended up with 5 different fucking tests and like all these medications for heart shit, and like, she didn't need that. Like, there's these things, these protocols they put in that give all this money to the doctors that take the money. Like, it's just a fucking laundering system.
So full disclosure, I have worked in the insurance industry for 12 years. I've tried to explain this to her in the past. It's very difficult. It's essentially a cartel, is what it is.
Totally.
Yes.
And it works through a process of essentially non-transparency. There's a complete lack of transparency in terms of pricing, absolute cost per procedure. So you have absolutely no idea.
Into the pharmaceuticals too.
Well, and not to mention the fact that price shopping is almost impossible. So much so that when you do try and price shop, the people at the medical office look at you like you have 15 heads. Like, well, why are you asking how much something costs? Right?
I broke three bones in my arm, and Matt had a repricer. I was like, I dislocated my elbow. I was trying to longboard for the first time ever and have 2 drinks.
Hey.
That's what cost me many months.
Yeah.
But like I had, first of all, we didn't have medical insurance, and the guy took thousands of dollars from me before he said, now that I've diagnosed you and tell you what you need, I'm no longer going to work with you because you don't have health insurance. But he had a repricer.
Wait, that wasn't the fireable offense. The fireable offense was my medical bill repricer contacted the office manager who sets all the pricing and does all the billing for the office. And the moment that I said I had a medical bill repricer, that was the moment that we got fired.
We got fired. I was like, and then I went to another surgeon who was like, first of all, this guy said I needed $150,000 6-hour surgery. I went to another surgeon and I said, I don't have health insurance. I was just told this.
She was like, just do some physical therapy.
I don't think you need surgery. Like, just do 3 months of physical therapy. And I'm like, all right, it all works. Yeah. But like, I mean, it was such a fucking scam.
Yeah.
And this is what insurance companies set you up for. If I had insurance, I would have had. And she had told me if I had gotten that surgery that he had explained to me, I would have had less mobility, less flexibility, and I would have probably had to get it redone in like 13 years.
Yes.
So like, and had I had insurance, I wouldn't have gone for the second opinion because it would have been taken care of and I would have been fucked.
Yeah.
Like, that shit's crazy.
The state, so when people talk about like how, well, we need socialized medicine because the costs are so high, they've diagnosed the problem correctly in the sense that the costs are so high, but the problem is that their solution to the problem is not correct, right? Like because they have this weird belief that we live in a free market. We don't. We live in a captive market. We live in a cartel market. So what happens? Yeah. So what the state does ultimately is the state uses licensing. The problem with the state, what the state does with licensing is this is the means they use to create a captive market, because the state determines who can work in this industry and how many people can work in this industry at a time, right? And they often have divisions and boards to determine this. So what happens is when they do this, when licensing is ultimately the state taking your rights and selling them back to you. And when they do this,
stop! Stop! That's ridiculous. I'm totally becoming an anarchist.
Yeah.
I'm not living to Acapulco now. That's so. Really quickly, not to cut you off, but like
you're going to.
Yeah. So I'm a therapist, but I never got licensed because I didn't want to work in certain areas where they were going to force me to work for 2 years.
Yeah.
So I never did it. And then I had a friend of mine who said that they knew someone who went to a therapist over the whole COVID thing for depression, right? Do you remember the story I was telling you? Mm-hmm. And she would go, and it was a psychiatrist who gave her drugs, but she was supposed, every time she'd like put her, like she'd call for her appointment, she would call for a 20-minute appointment at least, right? Or as a half-hour appointment or 20-minute appointment. And she was supposed to have a full 20 minutes to talk through how she was feeling on the medication and, you know, kind of say what's up and have a little bit of a therapy session and then get her, you know, drugs or whatever. So now for, I think, almost 2 years, her appointment has been 6 minutes. And the reason he leaves is because he has another call. This guy makes $250 per every 6 minutes he sees her. He's supposed to be 20 or 30 minutes. I forget. What did I tell you originally? 20?
No, I think it was 20 minutes.
20 minutes.
But what he ends up doing is he ends up triple booking every
20-minute
session.
Wait, listen to how much. You're the mathematician. And how much does he fucking make?
No,
this shit is sick.
He made like $1.2 million last year. And he's essentially just a
fucking giving drugs.
He's just a telemedicine pill popper. And
insurance pays for it.
Yeah, it was,
and they have no fucking clue.
The insurance guidelines.
But all he does is like follow the rules of insurance and just like go. And she's like, I don't know. I haven't said more than 2 words to him in like 2 years since COVID started.
Yeah. Right.
And she's like, but she needs her medication. She believes she needs her medication, so she continues going. But she hasn't talked to him in 2 years, like that. And that's what the insurance that we do right now is like breeding. You know.
Yeah.
definitely abuse of the system by doctors, abuse of the system by customers, like, or patients. I say customers. I'm not going to say patients. Fuck that shit.
No, they should be treated like customers instead of patients, because I think right now they're not that way. But
that's what the insurance breeds.
Talking about solutions that are in line with mutual aid, are you familiar with John Bush's freedom cells, Ace?
Yes, a little bit. Not probably as much as I should be, and as much as some people are, but I am familiar with it.
Yeah, it's very comparable to not necessarily purely mutual aid, but I mean it's essentially community building at the very essence of creating these subunits that are self-sustaining, but then also allowing those subunits to essentially specialize and then work with the other groups. So like all of these issues that we've been talking about, and we haven't really gotten involved in this movement, but I've heard like fantastic results from it. It's really that idea that like every single one of these units of 8, which is 8 families or 8 individuals, then can basically voluntarily associate with other groups of 8. And, you know, these other groups might have certain specialties or certain skill sets that would be of value to all the other different cells that are out there. It's absolutely fantastic idea. The key is being able to build the connections and then have people that are willing to like put these skills together, you know. But a very voluntarist, like anarchist idea, which I think was absolutely fantastic. But yeah, it's the downfall of mutual aid societies. Some of these fraternal cultural organizations that we used to have in the United States, charity hospitals, orphanages, you know, religious-based charities. I think all of these things are we should be mourning them because or at least trying to recreate them, you know.
Well, yeah, and in a name that go ahead.
Give me
no, I'm sorry, you can go ahead.
No, I was just saying in a name that's like fucking humane.
Yeah,
that's all.
Well, no,
just humane,
yeah,
like not fucking prisons where you throw kids.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, a big thing, and this is like, it's not an accident. This is not merely an accident where mutual aid societies are lost to history. I truly believe it's intentional that most people just have never heard of them. For one, because the state has to create reasons that the state has to create problems that it needs to solve, right? That's how they generate their reason for their own existence, right? So for an example, I think it's like a third or a quarter of all people during the Great Depression were a part of a mutual aid society. 1/4 to 1/3 of all people in America were a part of at least one mutual aid society at a time. That is a massive number. And the fact that most people have never read that in their history books, that's not in any history books, that's criminal, right? That they've completely erased an important part of like cultural history, that like, and the reason why I truly believe is they have to create this narrative that without them people would starve. That's never been the case. Like that they have to create this false version of human existence, of human life, where these people, they need us, they need to be, we need to be coddled by the state, we need, without welfare people would just die. It's never been true historically. It's never been the case. It's just
when you say mutual aid society, I know my dad used to talk about, because when he was a baby boomer, so he was born in 47, so when he was like, I guess like 10, 11, 12, he used to say that in Queens there was like a free clinic on every corner and nobody went to the hospital. Is that what you're talking about? No one went to the hospital. It was just, you went to the clinic and got cough medicine or something.
Yeah, that could be.
I'm sorry.
It could have been government based. I don't know enough with the information, you know what I mean? But it's but it also could have been a mutual aid society as well, because mutual aid societies also, usually the idea behind mutual aid is that you pay like a very little small amount of money to it, and then like every month, and then they will provide you like social services, because like people coming together, pooling their resources to provide services that they could not afford individually. But they also provided charity work as well for free. So that could have been a mutual aid society as well. I'm not sure, but that is kind of like in line with what the goal is. Yeah.
And it makes me think a little bit too about like church, like, and I know you're anti-religion, but like how some, like just the human, not anti-religion. I shouldn't have said
I'm
that.
not anti-religion.
I know. Organized religion. Is that better?
No, I'm not anti-organized religion.
But like it makes me think of the people that are very into religion and the want to help people that happens in that. Like there's so many people that like do pack, like school's coming, they're all packing school bags to send to freaking other countries and like the poor communities, and this is happening, you know, and that happen. I don't mean to say that you're anti anything.
No, I do not come at it from, for a long time I was religious, and then for a long time I was atheist, and now I would consider myself more spiritual than anything else. But there's value in those community building organizations, right? A lot of churches do extreme amounts of positive work within their communities. I think the people that need to understand that if they are religious, that the state is a direct competitor to their religious organization to do those things. They restrict their ability to do it. They have certain rules and regulations where they stop the church from being able to do.
Does that happen a lot? I feel like the government and church are together.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, in some cases, yes, they are. If it's like the higher ranking, you know, officials within it. I mean, shit, Jacobin had a letter that tried to make Joe Biden look like the second coming of Jesus Christ, for fuck's sake. But you know, it was like. You know, the idea of religion is not necessarily a bad thing because it comes from a place of community. I've known lots of people who could almost care less what the guidelines of the religion are.
They just want to help.
Yeah,
a community.
Yeah.
I mean, in the end, like we talk about it all the time, like just getting back to the roots of like tribalism in a sense. Not tribalism. That's not the right word.
No,
community.
But like community, localism. Yeah, like. Try like being able to lean on neighbors or people that are around you know.
And also there's also, and I think this is like sort of part of like the anarchist ethos, even though it's not spelled out specifically, but there's a certain part of it. There's a certain quality that there's just this general sense where you believe, and anarchists tend to believe that problems can be solved locally better than they can be just anywhere else, right? Like if there's some problem, right? You can apply for some type of mediation, like between like if two people are having a dispute, right? You might be that person who can go out and be the mediator between the dispute or something like that. So maybe help to solve the problem directly like that. And it's certainly better than, you know, in most cases, to de-escalate it and not, you know, go to some state court to solve your issue if you're having like some dispute. It's much quicker, much more efficient.
How do anarchists think of lawyers?
Oh, well, this is a great question.
Disputes.
So it's actually like most people probably think that anarchism is anti-lawyer, and they're current, and certainly there's cases where that's certainly true. We're anti-state lawyers.
Yes.
We're not a fan of prosecutors. We tend to like defense attorneys. I think mostly some, you know, I mean, you could make a good case probably that there's some defense attorneys you probably don't like, but in the general sense, we don't like prosecutors. But there would still be like in some sense like what are sometimes called tort courts, where it's like in an anarchist society where it'd be like if my neighbor wronged me or something, I could go to some arbitrator, and maybe the arbitrator would have like certain lawyers to like help the arbitrator come to a decision about like whether I was harmed or not, and whether I should be awarded like restitution for my neighbor, you know, harming me or something like that, or stealing from me or something like that. And it could be a completely like local process.
Which is interesting because so when you look back through the formation of the United States, or at least the lead up to the revolution, and then a lot of the writings that happened to end up forming the Articles of Confederation, and then kind of the back and forth between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, a lot of them believed in this concept of honor. And for them, it came from a very kind of like Judeo-Christian background. But to them, this idea that disputes shouldn't have to go to a court. Like it should be very rare that a dispute go to a court.
Go that far.
Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Like you should be able to figure it out.
well, yes,
You should have to go.
You and me as a sovereign free being, each one of us should be able to, with honor, dissolve our dispute in one way or shape or form.
Yeah.
You know, which is something that's been completely lost because the state is essentially dishonored everyone, and they've essentially stepped in to be that de facto
given
honor
guidelines
that people have.
Right?
No, it's not. It's not just guidelines. They've essentially co-opted everyone's honor. Like anyone who comes from, not to single them out, but you know, anyone who comes from kind of like an Asian descent also has a cultural heritage of honor, right? Like what comes to be your personal honor. If you look at what the government does, it
takes away.
Essentially takes it away from you and instills it in
that's an
itself.
interesting
And
thing.
that it has.
That's interesting.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
I have another question.
Go for it.
Sure.
Because me and you talk about this a lot.
Wait, is this a question or is this a really long story?
No, I'm not giving a story.
Without a question mark at the end.
Did I do that a lot?
You at least have to raise your voice at the end. All right, go ahead.
No. Well, so if you're in an anarchist society, right? What happens to the criminals? Is there, like you say,
Great question.
A lot of them get shot.
But no, but I mean, like, listen, there are people that are mentally ill and cause shit. There are fucking real serial killers. I know an 11-year-old who murdered 4 people. Like you know, so what, I mean, is there a defined system for something like that? Or is it just purely in the localized?
Yes. So I think it is generally I think it does take place within a local community. I think that would be like how it would happen mostly. As for like very dangerous people, oftentimes I think most what would happen generally is that if a person was truly violent, they probably wouldn't make it very far. You know what I mean? In an anarchist community, but
like
there's
people who had carry would like take care of it.
Right. Yeah. But let's push it back another level and say, okay, let's say something did happen. Generally speaking, so there's a great like little book. It's very short. It's by Robert Murphy called Chaos Theory, and he tackles this question directly, and I love his answer to it. So an example of, and like you'll have, I don't think I diverge necessarily, but I'm what people would call, and what I would call myself, is a prison abolitionist. And now this ties in really well. It's like, well, what do you do with the criminals necessarily? Like, because there are very bad people who should not be around other people who cause a lot of problems. An example of this, and I think this really goes into like people, I think this is one of people's main criticisms of anarchism, just like, what do you do with the really dangerous people? And I think what would happen generally is, like, let's give an example here. I'm in favor of restitution. So that means that if someone harms another person, I think they owe a certain amount of restitution to the victim or the victim's family. Right. And what this means ultimately is that every time they work or they collect a paycheck, a certain portion of it is given to the family. Let's say, especially if it's like a really serious crime, perhaps they're going to be doing that for the rest of their life. Maybe a certain amount of their paycheck is going to go to the victim's family. We can always ask, well, okay, let's say, what if someone is really stubborn and just refuses somehow to not pay, right? So one way that this has happened in past societies is that they would be blacklisted from legal protection. So the legal provider, or like the dispute resolution providers, would say, okay, you're not playing ball with us. We're not going to play ball with you. If anyone hurts this person, we will not prosecute you.
Wow.
And so this is how it
putting
happened.
a child, like someone who like is a sexual predator of children, in jail. I feel like that's what happens.
No, not in jail. You put them out
but
in
I mean,
the street
like,
with a red
well,
flag
yeah,
on them,
but
and
it,
you
like
say,
in this society, you put a child sexual predator in a jail and they get fucked up.
Yeah. So basically what would happen is that they'd say, okay, if you refuse to play ball, if you refuse to like make restitution to this family, and obviously, you know, if it's just like a theft or something or a crime like that, it probably wouldn't make it that far. But if it's a really serious crime and they just refuse, they're just like a low life and they just refuse to like make good on their restitution to the victim, then I think what would happen, generally speaking, is that they would just say, okay, we are not, it's within our rights to not prosecute anyone for, you know, looking the other way, essentially, if someone does something, and that is within their rights to do.
Yeah.
In some sense, yes, because it's like, because you'd be like, well, now there is another thing too, right? Which is a concept of like almost a voluntary isolation or involuntary imprisonment, where let's say this person now, let's take it now another step farther. This person's probably going to have to get out of town, right? They're going to have to get out of town because it's like, hey, I'm going to die here. If like you're a really serious criminal, that person, they're like, well, I'm going to die here. Now, there would be a market incentive for certain institutions to be like, okay, look, we will protect your rights if you stay in these premises and work for a living, and then maybe you can work for us and we will protect you, but you can't leave.
Yeah.
If you leave, we will no longer protect you, and now you're on your own again, right?
So something that really resonated with me when I was kind of thinking through my opposition to the death penalty, because I think the state should not be able to be given the opportunity to terminate someone's life because they do it with,
and they never know 100%.
Such egregious imbalance and injustice. Sam Konkin and a couple of other libertarian and anarchist thinkers actually thought of the idea of like work camps as a means of paying restitution, because I always thought it was the worst possible scenario that someone takes someone else's life, and then in return you're essentially taking their life. And whether or not you believe in the death penalty or not, whether they spend life in prison or if you're actually executing them, they're not in any way making good for what they took, right? Like there's no balance there. There's no not that I'm a fan of like necessarily retribution, but there's no kind of like, give and take there, or at least some kind of trying to like make things whole, right?
People who have had these situations, like their husband or son was killed by, say, a drunk driver, or by somebody who literally murdered them. And I see these all the time on my grief groups.
Yeah.
There are two kinds of people. There are the people that want their fucking ass.
They want retribution.
And there are the people that I want to hug this person because I feel like they're a human person.
Yeah.
And there might be some in the middle, but I haven't seen it. Yeah. Like it seems to be like what on the other side. This is a
great conversation.
But I
love this type of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is. But maybe it's left up to the people who are victims.
I think the answer is it depends on the community, right?
Practically speaking, I think that's absolutely true, right? It is. So here's an example, right? So Bob Murphy proposes this analogy because a lot of times when people talk about restitution-based systems versus retribution-based systems, a lot of people in favor of retribution will say, well, how can you just like be okay with them just paying restitution? Doesn't this person deserve to die? And Bob Murphy's a pacifist, and I'm not a pacifist, but I tend to lean like close to that. In the sense of like I tend to favor restorative justice. Now, in terms of, but now someone who says, well, doesn't this person deserve to die? Now let's Bob Murphy proposes this analogy, which I think is great. Let's say, just theoretically, let's say the only fine or the only penalty you have to pay for murdering a person is $5 to the victim's family. Now this sounds horrible on its face, right? But let's go a step further. If you murder the murderer, you only have to pay $5.
Yeah.
That's the other side of the coin.
Yes, that is the other side of the coin to that. Now, obviously, the restitution would be much more than $5. But he just uses that as like a kind of funny example to say now. On the other hand, you can also, flip it the other way. Now this is also something too, like contrasted with the state's justice system. And I believe this goes back to times in monarchy, right? Whereas if someone murders someone, the state is taking the burden upon them, or they're essentially stepping in the middle of this and saying that no, you harm society. You are going to jail because you essentially did something that we deemed hurt us. And we're going to imprison you because of this. And this goes back all the way back to monarchy, because oftentimes when someone killed another person, the monarch would say, you hurt my property.
Yeah.
You essentially hurt my subject, and I'm going to put you to death or in prison for this.
That is 100% correct.
And this legally kind of carried over into like current legal systems. So when the state does this, they're essentially putting them in prison because it's like, hey, you harmed our cattle in some sense.
That's sick.
And think about that. No, think about this too, right? Is that now when that person's sitting in prison, the victim's family is paying for that person's prison stay through taxation. Their tax dollars are going to pay for that person's room and board now. So, and that's how it works right now. So you can see, like, even if you're a person who does believe in retribution, the state is still not giving you that. The state, and it's also not rehabilitative if you believe in rehabilitation, right?
Oh no, so Joss has seen it firsthand. It's the complete opposite. I mean, it's essentially a self-perpetuating cycle, or it's essentially creating your own market, because the vast majority of nonviolent criminals that go in, that if there's no victim, there's no crime. Like, there should be no law, right?
They become bigger criminals.
But they go into the system, and then they end up turning into violent criminals as a result.
And they have to survive a lot of times, because it's like, so they tend to become more violent as they come out. So if you believe in retribution, you don't get what you want with the state system. If you believe in rehabilitation, you definitely don't get what you want in the state system. And if you believe in restorative justice, you definitely don't get what you want with the state system. So everyone here is not getting what they want. So pretty much every type of like philosophy of justice here is not being satisfied with the state's rule.
Yeah, I'm highly interested in that $5 thing. It actually sounds pretty interesting.
Well, what you say all the time, and you have to imagine society as different, right? Because if you were in an anarchist society, you would have open carry, right? I mean, that wouldn't be an issue.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh,
so like, people would be defending themselves in different ways. So how many criminals would you have?
Think about it this way.
What kinds of criminals would you have?
Think about it this way. If you took all of the non-violent criminals that are in prisons right now,
right,
and they weren't criminalized for their behavior, and then you took the number of violent criminals that are in prison right now that would have been thwarted based off of people owning firearms, there would be almost no one in prison.
I would say one thing, that I have dealt with the schizophrenic and mentally ill, and there is absolutely, those people don't give a shit how many people open carry around them when they're in their boats.
Yeah.
Like, there are, now I don't believe they should be like killed or anything like they are literally sick.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of them. And then you think about all the people that are, like, I'm going back to my rant, on pharmaceutical medications and stuff that are having aggression from that. I mean, who do you fucking blame in the end? I don't even know. I mean, we're so far.
Hold on. Life is not about blame.
I know.
Okay, people need to get away from that. It's not about blame. Life is about existence. It's about freedom, and it's about, like, whether or not you're able to live on your own terms.
But what are we creating? That's the question.
No. People who have to blame others and things like that.
I mean, I don't feel like do you feel like I blame others?
No, I don't think you blame others.
I just feel like
there are a lot of other people, though, that would choose to project
I love people
or pass blame, and never look in the mirror.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I love people, and I feel like people in general, I just think it goes back to it. We're so far from human nature.
Here, I have a solution, Ace. I think she needs to hang out in the hippie commune.
The hippie commune's all good with me.
But then what you need to do is you need to form a voluntary contract with the ANCAPs that live next door that have lots of automatic weapons to provide security for the outside.
And
of
I'll
the
watch their
hippie commune.
babies.
Yeah,
They
no, I
don't
think
wanna-
that's a fantastic.
And see, this is also something great about anarchism is it really provides this plurality of lifestyles that people can live peacefully together with, right? So like you can have different types of lifestyles. Like you can live like look, as long as it's voluntary, you can have you can have a commune. You can have like a more industrial, like market-based area if you want. You can have more of like, if people want to just like live out on the land and sort of like and live out like a primitivist lifestyle, in their own little area. Everyone can do this, and if we want to interact or trade or like interact peacefully together, we can do this, and it's completely fine. And anarchism completely permits that. The only thing anarchism doesn't permit is subjugating another person to your rule. And anything that doesn't do that is completely fine by anarchist standards, at least for like permitting it.
I like it.
I think that is a fantastic point to end on.
I like it.
Are you good with that?
I feel like we went full circle with
We totally did.
licensure and insurance. I don't know how to say those two together. Licensure and insurance.
Yes. Yeah. It's
And
like
then
when
we
you've been
went-
drinking,
we
you can
touched
never say the
everything.
word judicial system.
Licensurance.
Yeah,
Lic-
licensurance. Yeah. All right. Really quickly.
I have loved you. I think you're fantastic.
One more time, Ace.
Oh.
Where can people find your information?
So you can find me on Twitter at ace_archist. You can find me on Substack. I'm really been delayed on a Substack I've been writing, and I apologize for that. I told people it'd be out a while back. It hasn't come out yet. I am so sorry, but it will be out fairly shortly. You can find the Substack at acearchist.substack.com. And then I have a podcast, a new podcast with my friend Dean. We do it every week. It's out every Monday. It's called The End Times Continue. And you can find us at tetc.show or on any podcatcher, pretty much. So yeah,
Awesome.
It's been such a pleasure being here. So thank you guys so much for inviting me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You were like part teacher, part therapist tonight. I appreciate it.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Poor Matt.
No, you guys are great.
Yeah. And that's a reminder. If you guys are still with us, hit the like button, subscribe. We're not monetized on YouTube, but we do not endeavor to be, but do help us with the algorithm so that we can get this out in front of as many people as possible. And with that, any final comments?
No, just the time is ripe for people to move through this conversation because there's so much that is very apparent and easily point outable. I don't know if that's a word.
Identifiable. Yeah.
Identifiable.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like it's the time.
So, it's definitely the time. So with that, we'll be back next Monday, 9 p.m. I think we might have Shane Hazel with us. Yeah, he's always.
I'm excited for that one too.
So, so Ace, thank you very much again. I appreciate.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you guys so much.
Wonderful conversation. I'm sorry if I cut you off.
No,
no, you're fine. You guys are fine. I'm sorry if I ever cut you guys off.
And everyone needs to check out the feudal battles. And I don't mean like feudal as in futility. I mean feudal as in like knights with armor that Ace engages with on Twitter every single day. I think they're absolutely fantastic.
Thank you so much.
You've taught me a ton because you go through those like hypotheticals and stuff like that, which I absolutely love. So
well, thank you. That means a lot.
Yeah, it's a huge value. So with that,
awesome.
End of the episode.
I think so.
Peace.
Later, guys.